so you came back. If you don't sleep, it won't be my fault. Tie up the dogs, make the signal with the horns so the hunters can gather. And let's turn back to the city. Night is approaching, and it's All Saints' Day, and we are at the Mount of the Souls. So soon. If it were another day, I would finish off that pack of wolves that the snows of Moncayo have thrown into their burrows. But today it's impossible. Soon the prayer of the Templars will sound, and the souls of the deceased will begin to ring their bell in the chapel of the Mount. That chapel is in ruins. Bah! Do you want to scare me? No, beautiful cousin, you don't know how much is happening in this country, because it hasn't even been a year since you came from so far away. Rein in your mare. I will also set mine to a walk, and while the journey lasts, I'll tell you that story. The pages gathered in cheerful and noisy groups. The Counts of Borges and Alcudiel mounted their magnificent horses and followed their children, Beatriz and Alonso, who were leading the group at quite a distance. As they moved forward, Alonso began to tell the promised story. That mountain, which is now called the Souls, belonged to the Templars, whose convent is there, by the riverbank. The Templars were both warriors and religious. After being besieged by the Arabs, the king summoned them from the other lands to defend the city from the side of the bridge, causing a notable grievance to its owners, the nobles of Castile, who alone were able to defend it and ultimately managed to conquer it. A deep hatred arose between the knights of the Templar order and the nobles of the city. The knights reserved the mountain for hunting, while the nobles decided to organize a big hunt despite the prohibitions from the clergy. The expedition took place and turned into a horrific battle. The mountain was left strewn with corpses, and the wolves had a bloody feast. Finally, the king intervened and declared the mountain abandoned. The chapel of the religious, located in El Monte, began to fall into ruin. Since then, they say that on the night of the dead, the bell of the chapel can be heard, and the souls of the deceased are wrapped in shrouds. In tattered shrouds, they run like in a fantastic hunt. The deer roar, the wolves howl, and the snakes hiss. The next day, the footprints of the dead can be seen in the snow. That's why, in Soria, they call this mountain the One of the Souls. Alonso's narration ended just as the two young people arrived at the fountain that leads into the city. There they waited for the rest of the group, which then got lost in the narrow and dark streets of Soria. The servants had just lifted the tablecloths. The tall Gothic chimney of the palace of the Counts of Cudiel emitted a bright glow, illuminating some groups of ladies and gentlemen who were chatting casually. The wind battered against the leaded glass of the windows in the hall. Beatriz and Alonso seemed oblivious to the general conversation. Beatriz continued to gaze, entranced, at the whims of the flame. As Alonso watched the reflection of the fire flicker in Beatriz's eyes, both kept a deep silence. The maids told eerie tales about ghosts and apparitions, and the bells of the church of Sorios rang in the distance with a monotonous toll. And sadly, I'm going to exchange the description of the jewelry for another beautiful word, cousin, Alonso finally exclaimed, breaking the long silence they were in. Soon we are going to part, perhaps forever. The arid plains of Castile, its rough and warlike customs, its simple and patriarchal habits, I know you don't like them, I've heard you sigh several times. Is there perhaps a suitor from your distant estate? Beatrice made a gesture of cold indifference. A whole character of a woman was revealed in that faded contraction of her thin lips. Maybe because of the pomp of the French court where you've lived here. Jair, the young man, hurried. In one way or another, I sense that I won't be long in losing you. When we part, I would like you to take a memory of me. Do you remember when we went to the temple to thank God for restoring your health that you came to this land to seek? The brooch that held the feather of my cap caught your attention. How beautiful you would look holding a veil over your dark hair. Have you already learned the one for a bride? My father gave it to my mother, and she took it to the altar. Do you want it? I am not in your country, the beautiful one replied, but in mine. Accepting an offering means committing to a will. Only on a ceremonial day can you accept a gift from a relative. And even so, one can take a long journey without getting anything in return. The icy tone with which Beatrice pronounced these words momentarily unsettled the young man. After calming down, she said sadly, I understand, cousin, but today we celebrate all the saints, including yours. Today is a day of ceremonies and gifts. Will you accept mine? Beatrice lightly bit her lips and reached out her hand to take the brooch. Without saying a single word, the two young people fell silent again, and the hoarse voices of the old women could be heard talking about witches and drinks. The buzzing of the wind that made the glass of the arches creak and the sad, monotonous tolling of the bells could be heard from afar. After a few minutes, the interrupted dialogue resumed. Before the Day of All Saints ends, when both your saint and mine are celebrated, you will give me a keepsake without committing your will, he said, fixing an intense gaze on his cousin. He looked at him with a devilish thought, and she said, Why not? And searching for something in her velvet sleeve, with a look of regret, she added, Do you remember the blue ribbon I wore today that you said was the emblem of your soul? Yes, it's been lost. I was thinking of leaving it for you as a keepsake. It's been lost, said Alonso. And where? With fear and hope I don't know, Beatrice said. On the mountain, perhaps. In the mountain of the souls, Alonso murmured, pale with fear. Then he continued, in a choked and muffled voice, You know it because you've probably heard it 1,000 times in the city, throughout Castile. They call me the King of Hunters. I've brought all the vigor of my youth to this amusement. Image of war. I know the lairs and the habits of the beasts, as I have fought with them day and night, on foot and on horseback, alone and in a group. Another night I would fly for that ribbon, but tonight I'm scared. Do you hear them? The bells are tolling. The prayer has sounded in San Juan del Duero. The souls of the mountain will begin to lift their yellowed skulls from among the weeds. The souls, whose mere sight can freeze the blood of the bravest. As the young man spoke, an imperceptible smile appeared on Beatrice's lips, who exclaimed in an indifferent tone while stoking the fire, which crackled and popped, throwing sparks of 1,000 colors. Oh, she exclaimed mockingly, that's not disastrous. What madness! To go up to the mountain now for such a trifle, on such a dark night, the night of the dead, with the path filled with wolves. Alonso understood the bitter irony of her words. He stood up and exclaimed in a firm voice, Goodbye, Beatrice. Goodbye. See you soon. She said, "Alonso, Alonso," turning around quickly, but the young man had already disappeared. A few minutes later, the sound of a horse galloping away faded into the distance. Beatrice, with a look of satisfied pride, listened to the fading sound. Meanwhile, the maids continued with their tales of wandering spirits. The air buzzed against the balcony windows, and the city bells rang in the distance. Several hours had passed and Alonso still hadn't returned. Beatrice withdrew to her oratory and exclaimed, "He must have been so scared," exclaimed the young woman, closing her prayer book. After turning off the lamp and drawing the silk curtains, she fell into a restless and nervous sleep. The clock struck 12 in the postigo. Beatrice heard the bells and half opened her eyes, thinking she heard her name in a distant and mournful voice. The wind was moaning against the window panes, and said, "It must be the wind." Trying to calm herself, her heart was beating harder and harder. The doors of the oratory began to open one after another, each time closer, producing deep sounds and long wails. Then, silence. A silence filled with strange whispers, monotonous murmur of distant water, distant barking of dogs, confused voices, echoes of footsteps coming and going, rustling of clothes, stifled sighs, fatigued breaths. Beatrice, motionless and trembling, leaned her head out from behind the curtains and listened. She heard 1,000 different noises and ran her hand across her forehead, but when she listened again, it was all silence. She saw shapes moving in all directions with a nervous glow. When she focused her gaze, all she could see was darkness and impenetrable shadows. "Bah!" she exclaimed, resting her head on a blue satin pillow. "I'm just as scared as those poor people whose hearts race with terror at the sound of a ghost story." Beatrice closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but in vain. She sat up again, more pale and terrified. It was no longer an illusion. The drapes of the doors were moving, and slow footsteps could be heard on the carpet. The footsteps were muffled and continuous, accompanied by a lot of creaking. They approached and moved the kneeler next to her bed. Beatrice let out a scream and hid under the blankets. The wind was battering the windows. The water from the fountain fell monotonously. The dogs were barking in the distance, and the bells were tolling sadly for the souls of the deceased. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. At last, the dawn broke, and Beatrice, relieved, opened her eyes to the first rays of light. She pulled back the silk curtains and was about to laugh at her fears when a cold sweat covered her body. On the kneeler, she saw the blue band, bloody and torn, that Alonso had gone to fetch from the mountain. When Beatrice's servants arrived, frightened, to give her the news of Alonso's death, who had been found in the morning, devoured by wolves among the underbrush of the Mountain of Souls. They found Beatrice in a terrifying state. Her motionless and tense body clung with both hands to one of the wooden columns of her bed. Her eyes, wide and unhinged, were immersed in an inconceivable horror, while her mouth, slightly open, seemed frozen in a final scream, her lips as white as wax, and her limbs rigid as they revealed the truth more horrifying. She was dead from pure terror. They say that after this event, a lost hunter spent the night at the Mount of Souls. Before he died, he said he saw terrible things. The skeletons of the Templars and the noble Besorios rose from their graves. They presided over a beautiful and pale woman, She, with bare and bloody feet, she ran around Alonso's grave, letting out screams of horror. And so ends the tale of the Mount of Souls, a place where terror is eternal. The tragedy of Alonso and Beatriz merges with the shadows and the wind of the night of the dead. The skeletons of the Templars and the nobles perpetuate the horror, while the bells of Soria continue to toll for the lost souls.